It was a somber Napoleon who entered Vipsk at 8 a.m. on the 29th of July, to find a ghost town inhabited only by the sick and wounded in the local canal. He at once held a council of war, where Berthier, Murat and Eugene all urged him strongly to halt the campaign in light of the enormous losses in men and material. At first he was inclined to acquiesce and again procrastinated, spending 2 weeks in Vipsk and giving every indication of being prepared to winter there. Eugene was overjoyed to see him roll up his maps and declare that the I-8IZ campaign was over. "We won't repeat Charles XII's folly," he declared. But this mood lasted just 24 hours. A cautious policy did not suit Napoleon's temperament, and he was not the man to tarry 8 months in Vipsk when he could be in Moscow in 20 days. In vain did Berthier, Duroc, Caulaincourt, Eugene and all his intimates press him for a definite decision to winter either there or in Smolensk. He rounded on them, accusing them of being soft and pampered, with thoughts only of money, pleasure, hunting and the delights of Parisian social life. It was not for that, he chided them, that he had made them marshals of France. Besides, he knew Alexander and he was confident that he would not abandon either Smolensk or Moscow without a fight. The very danger pushes us on to Moscow. The die is cast. Victory will vindicate us. Once again the Grand Army resumed its reluctant march. The Emperor set out 2 days later. By this time the two Russian armies had united, but the Cold War of mutual hatred between the two commanders undid most of the potential advantage of this. There was no question of a lightning strike towards Smolensk to catch Barclay and Bagration unawares, for such a step would simply mean the armies outstripping its supply wagons. But the impatient emperor still yearned to get behind the enemy so as to be between them and Moscow, and thus force them finally to the battle they had so long avoided. Meanwhile Bagration and his circle, who had grown increasingly fretful at the constant retreating, taunted Barclay with cowardice and forced his hand. When the two Russian armies united at the beginning of August, making a force IZS 0 strong, Barclay finally buckled under the pressure from his critics, who by this time included the Tsar. He laid plans for a counterattack. It has often been pointed out that Barclay had only two sensible options, either to turn Smolensk into an impregnable fortress or to 511 advance to the Orsha Gap. Barclay did neither, mainly because he feared Bagration was intriguing against him and would use any mistake he made to discredit him. He advanced cautiously. The first clash of arms, between the Cossacks and French cavalry, came at Inkovo to the northwest of Smolensk on the 8th of August. But when a further acrimonious clash of personalities led Bagration to withdraw cooperation, Barclay panicked at the thought of a possible ingenious Bonaparte counter-offensive, and pulled back again. Napoleon, who had been hoping to lure Barclay into a trap, now opted for what he called the Smolensk maneuver. This involved a strategic envelopment which would place several French army corps in the enemy rear. The Russians calculated that Napoleon would continue north of the river Dnieper along the Minsk-Smolensk-Moscow road, bypassing the city. He would cross the Dnieper only if he meant to attack Smolensk. The Emperor did the unexpected and crossed the river on a mile front, using the unguarded bridge at Orsha and 4 pontoon bridges at Rossesna. At first things went well. Murat and Ney swept aside the single Russian division Barclay had stationed at Krasno, 30 miles from Smolensk, and moved in on the city, confident of being able to get round behind Barclay. By the 14th of August 17 seconds, 0 French troops were south of the river. The envelopment would have worked, but for Barclay's panicky withdrawal, which once more took his forces out of range. The French began to encounter stiffer resistance than expected. At the approaches to the city the Russian defenders under Neverovsky fought with ferocious courage while Murat wasted an entire day trying to smash through their lines with unsupported cavalry. But for this check the French would have reached Smolensk on the evening of the 14th of August. When Napoleon heard of Murat's failure, he ordered a 24-hour pause to regroup, losing the element of surprise and allowing Barclay and Bagration to pull back behind the defenses of Smolensk. The 24 hours should have given the Emperor pause for serious thought. The Grand Army was losing 6,000 men a day from sickness and desertion. Artillery horses had not been properly shod to deal with conditions on the steppes, so that large numbers of cannon were being left behind. The non-French troops were not performing well. The whole force was ill-equipped, and in the rush to press men into service, large numbers of unfit men had been drafted. There was little versatility in the ranks, and Napoleon lamented the shortage of his old jack-of-all military trades veterans. It now turned out that dragoons had been hurriedly transformed into lancers, but did not know how to use their lances. The army was down to 175,000 effectives in the Central Group 512, and even while it shrank in size daily, the French army was dangerously strung out. What with Oudinot, who had defeated Wittgenstein at Polotsk, and MacDonald, who was besieging Riga. Napoleon's front extended 500 miles. Moreover, if the emperor had been honest with himself, he would have reflected that he was no longer the great captain of 1796 or 1805. The 24 hours stretched to 36 hours, for it was only in the small hours of the 16th of August that French advance units began to probe the outskirts of Smolensk. Finally, the emperor ordered a frontal assault, even though the city was well fortified and defended. It was to be a characteristic of the 1812 campaign that he tended to order frontal attacks of the kind he would have spurned in the days of his greatness. This time he justified his decision on the ground that, if he tried to ford the Dnieper to the east, he would be vulnerable to a Russian counterattack which could split his army. Accordingly, on the 16th of August, after a fierce bombardment of the city, he ordered the three corps under Ney, Devout and Poniatowski to take the suburbs of Smolensk. After grim hand-to-hand and building-to-building fighting, the French finally took possession of the outreaches but then found themselves faced by the 15-foot thick walls of the inner city. At dusk the Russians still held the old town, with the French firmly ensconced in the suburbs but with the prospect of a second siege of Acre before them. Next day there was more bloody fighting which barely altered the overall picture. At nightfall the Russians were still in possession of the city, having taken terrible losses but having also inflicted 0,000 casualties on the French in the two-day battle. Napoleon's critics are adamant that the battle was unnecessary, and that if he had crossed the Dnieper farther east he could have cut the Smolensk-Moscow road. It was the possibility of such a move that led the Russians to evacuate the city during the night of 17-1 the 8th of August, following recriminations between Bagration and Barclay so vehement that relations between them finally and irretrievably broke down. Once again it was Bagration's accusing Barclay of cowardice that caused violent antipathy to Bagration, who wanted to stay and slug it out for a third day. The order to retreat came close to treason and was an insult to the patriots who fell in the defense of Smolensk. But Barclay had read his opponent better, and there is no doubt that if he had remained for a third day's fighting, he would have been surrounded. As it was, even when retreating fast he was nearly encircled. Ney and Junot got round behind him late on the 18th, but the chance was lost when Junot refused to press the attack. When he heard the news next day, Napoleon was 513 furious, and told his aides, "Junot has let them escape. He is losing the campaign for me." Junot never recovered from the disgrace, went mad and finally threw himself out of a window to his death in July 1813. Perhaps his mind was already on the turn at Smolensk, for he was known to have brooded that he, alone of the emperor's inner circle, had not received his marshal's baton, despite having started with Bonaparte at Toulon and been with him in Egypt and Austerlitz. In his own mind, too, he had been made the Duke of Obrance for his sterling services in Spain. The main French army began entering Smolensk at dawn on the 18th, to find it a smoking ruin and a charnel house of corpses. Even hardened veterans vomited at the gruesome piles of dead and dying they saw. Napoleon meanwhile spent the day once again in inactivity and indecision, this time uncertain whether the Russians were retreating north or east and therefore reluctant to commit the bulk of his army. Yet again his inertia ruined the chance of finding the two enemy armies and splitting them. He was particularly at fault in not staying in close touch with Ney and Junot, whose timidity he might have been able to overrule. Instead he returned from the front to Smolensk to rest at 5 p.m. He was in vindictive mood that day. Fires were still raging through the battle-scarred city and the emperor, with ill-judged levity, described the devastation as a second eruption of Vesuvius. Pointing to the inferno still raging, he nudged Caulaincourt. "Isn't that a fine spectacle?" "Horrible, sire," Caulaincourt replied. Napoleon made a dismissive gesture. "You should remember the saying of one of the Roman emperors, 'The corpse of an enemy always smells good.'" It was noticeable that the emperor, his keen sense of smell notwithstanding, was the only one who seemed unaffected by the stench of the dead and the scale of the suffering. In cynical mood he wrote to Mamet, his foreign minister, boasting that he had captured Smolensk without the loss of a single man. But he was not the only cynic. The Russians, in headlong flight, had the self-deceiving audacity to celebrate a solemn Te Deum in St. Petersburg for the victories of Vitebsk and Smolensk. For another week Napoleon remained in Smolensk, seemingly still dithering, still undecided what to do next, but apparently hoping that the capture of the holy city of Smolensk would make the Tsar see reason and come to terms. While Murat was sent to dog Barclay's tracks, the emperor brooded on his third failure to bring the Russians to a decisive battle. There seemed to have been a succession of errors: failure to scout Novorossiysk's defense force properly on the 14th, the day of inactivity on the RSDH, underestimate of the fortifications of Smolensk, which 514 turned out to be much stronger than expected during the Battle of 16-17, the failure to cut the Moscow road initially and then the dispatch of the wrong commander Aunot on the 18th to cut off Barclay's retreat. But it seems that the week's delay in Smolensk was more a product of complacency than genuine indecision, for, if we may believe Murat, the emperor told him on the 17th that he was determined to pursue Barclay to the gates of Moscow if necessary. For that reason Murat felt suicidal, and deliberately exposed himself to Russian shellfire that evening. If even a hard-driving hothead like Murat balked at the idea of an advance on Moscow, it says much for the general mood in the French higher command. On St. Helena, Napoleon conceded that pressing on from Smolensk instead of wintering there was the greatest blunder of his life, but insisted there was more rationality in the decision than he had been credited with. Time, and in Napoleon's mind it was always a question of time, was against him, and so, knowing the risks, he committed the Grand Army to a winter campaign for which it was unprepared. As he saw it, the pluses outnumbered the minuses. Russian morale was bound to grow with the propaganda advantage of an undefeated army, so that by 1813 they would be both materially and psychologically stronger, while the French grew weaker. A 6-month delay would enable Alexander to draw in his Moldavian and Finnish allies, and press more men from the back country, to say nothing of the aid he might get from Britain. The canard that Napoleon had been halted in his tracks would give fresh heart to the Prussians and Austrians, and might even persuade them to switch sides in the next campaigning season. An early offensive in 1813 against the overstretched French front would be 1807 all over again, and Napoleon had not forgotten Eylau. On the other hand, Moscow was only 270 miles ahead. Its inhabitants would panic if he advanced, and, if the Tsar would not fight for Smolensk, he would surely fight for Moscow. Napoleon still sought the decisive military victory that would bring Russia to the peace table, and his prestige and credibility demanded that he advance on Moscow. Otherwise it could be said he had overreached himself and fallen short of his aims. But the overriding reason for Napoleon's decision was political rather than military. Aware of the depth of opposition to him in Paris, he could not afford to stay away for more than a year. So it was that the political tail, salted by the notables, wagged the military dog on the Russian front. And so it was that Murat, Caulaincourt and all his marshals, with the single exception of Davout, urged him in vain to winter in Smolensk. 515. Their arguments were various. The Grand Army was now reduced to 60,000 effectives, many demoralized and exhausted, and would diminish further as fresh garrisons were left along the route. The problems of supply and horses were bound to multiply. If he lost a battle outside Moscow, his plight would be desperate. But if he won, he would be bottled up in Moscow for the 6 months of winter, unable to move against St. Petersburg until spring, and with an ever more tenuous supply line. Therefore he should dig in at Smolensk. Both his flank armies had won victories. He still had time to capture Kiev and Riga this year, and he could build up a new army behind the defensive screen at Smolensk by promising Polish independence. But Napoleon argued that there was a momentum in war which had to be seized. Excited by the news that Barclay was going to make a stand some 50 miles to the east, he exaggerated a skirmish fought at Valutino by Ney and Murat on the 19th of August, swept aside all objections, and ordered an advance on Moscow. On the 25th of August the Grand Army left Smolensk. Once again the soldiers suffered terribly on the onward march, stifled by dust and pelted with rain. They used improvised masks against sandstorms and were reduced to slaking their thirst with horses' urine because of the shortage of water. Soon even that expedient became problematical, as the horses were dying in thousands from starvation. There were not enough fields for the horses to graze in, and no time to let them eat their fill even if there were. One division which crossed the Niemen with 7,500 horses had just 0 left at the beginning of September. Yet another factor contributing to the wastage of horses was the cavalry tactics employed by the French. Alarmingly, Murat, the dashing cavalry commander, revealed on this campaign that he knew nothing whatever about the care of horses. Although the animals have about the same stamina as humans over long distances, they must be taken along slowly, alternating the walk and the trot, and fed well. At full gallop a horse could not cover more than 3 miles without great risk, and could easily be killed by being forced to canter or slow gallop for 5 miles without rest. Usually Napoleon was good at bolstering the morale of his men, but this time he remained aloof and did not share their hardships, choosing instead to travel in some style. His personal impedimenta included 8 canteen wagons, a carriage for his wardrobe, 2 butlers, 2 valets, 3 cooks, 4 footmen and 8 grooms. He himself usually traveled in a 6-horse coach, sleeping on a makeshift couch if no suitable house or 516 monastery was available when night fell. He worked all day long, even when in motion, since the carriage was fitted with a desk and lights. Such luxury might have been excusable in the emperor, but was barely tolerable in the case of the host of hangers-on who accompanied him. For their transport the huge imperial staff of aides and bureaucrats used up 52 carriages, 650 horses and innumerable carts. On the 5th of September Napoleon found the Russians waiting in entrenched positions on the banks of the river Moskova, with their center around the village of Borodino, and under a new commander. On the 20th of August the Tsar had finally listened to the clamor against Barclay, and the protests about continual retreat, and appointed a new commander. General Michael Kutuzov was a corpulent 67-year-old one-eyed W9 Manizer, and bon vivant but unquestionably the Russians' best captain. Lazy, lethargic, cautious, jealous of subordinates, reluctant to read or sign orders and generally willful and unmalleable, Kutuzov was none the less a soldier of deep cunning, shrewd intuition and keen instinct. Alexander, who blamed him for the debacle at Austerlitz, never liked him, but was advised by his military council that no one else would do. A reluctant Tsar made him commander-in-chief but with orders to abandon Barclay's Fabian approach and face the French in battle. Kutuzov thought this was poor advice and, left to himself, would not have confronted Napoleon at Borodino. But faced with a direct order and under pressure of public opinion, he had no choice but to give battle. He spent the 5th and 6th of September preparing his battle positions. The field of combat he chose was mainly open farmland from which the corn had just been harvested, with small copses of fir and birch dotted about. His right was behind the river Kalacha and his left on Borodino village astride the old post road between Moscow and Smolensk. In the center was the great redoubt with 18 big guns, and flanking this the main army was drawn up on undulating countryside broken by streams and ravines which ran down to the new Smolensk-Moscow road. The Russian left center was deployed around the 3 redoubts of Semenovsky, and the left wing itself, under Bagration, covered the village of Uditsa. It was a very strong defensive position, manned by RZ-0000 Russian troops with 640 guns. Napoleon took up station at the Skivardino redoubt, d miles west. He had fewer guns than the enemy and his numbers were down to IJ-0000, less than a third of the front line strength with which he had crossed the Niemen. Many of his men were sick, exhausted and half-starved by the endless marches that had outstripped convoy supplies. He needed all his ingenuity to overcome 517 Kutuzov's clever dispositions, but astonished his marshals by opting for a direct frontal assault on the Russian right and center, leaving Poniatowski to work round Bagration at Uditsa. Devout and Ney were to assault the redoubts of Semenovsky, while to Eugene de Beauharnais went the mission impossible and near suicidal attack on the heavily armored Great Redoubt. Junot's corps, Murat's cavalry and the guard would be held in reserve. The battle plan was so unimaginative that Devout begged to be allowed to take 40,000 men and outflank the Russian left with an overnight march. A listless emperor would not hear of it. "Ah, you are always for turning the enemy. It is too dangerous a maneuver," he told Devout. This lackluster response to an obvious suggestion has always puzzled military historians. It is well known that on 6th–7th of September the emperor was ill, with a heavy cold and a bladder infection, and to this illness the many mishaps at Borodino are sometimes attributed. Others say that by now he was worried by the caliber of his cavalry and the morale of his infantry, and that lack of numbers meant he had to rule out the idea of detaching a large corps. But the more likely explanation is that Napoleon was now desperate for a battle at all costs, having seen the Russians slip through his net 3 times already. An additional factor may have been that just before Borodino he received word that Wellington had won a great victory at Salamanca in Spain. Circumstantial evidence works in favor of this interpretation, for during the night of 6th–7th of September the emperor constantly rose from his bed to reassure himself that the Russians were still there, and had not once more melted away into the night. It was not until 2 a.m. that he felt confident enough to issue one of his famous bulletins. The battle began with an artillery barrage at 6 a.m. on the 7th of September. Then Napoleon ordered his forces forward. Ney and Devout performed well but necessarily made slow progress over broken ground, so, just 2 hours into the battle, the emperor committed Junot's corps from the reserve. When Poniatowski attacked Bagration, Kutuzov immediately transferred troops from his right to prevent breakthrough. The Russian commander then took the initiative, outflanking Borodino with his cavalry. While the French attended to this threat, the assault on the Great Redoubt was delayed. The marshals began to grow restive. The emperor was not at the front of his army, inspiring and exhorting his men while watching minutely every nuance in the ebb and flow of battle. Instead, he remained in the rear, ill, indecisive, listless and querulous, suspicious of the accuracy of every report brought to him. In frustration, Ney burst out with, "Why is the emperor in the rear of the army? If he is no longer 518 a general, then he should go back to the Tuileries and let us be generals for him." The first breakthrough for the French came with the fall of Uditsa, during which Bagration was mortally wounded. But a lull allowed the Russians to move men across and hold the line at prepared positions. Predictably, however, the centerpiece of the entire battle was the titanic struggle for the Great Redoubt, which went on in more or less intense form from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. Eugene managed to take Borodino village but could make no headway against the redoubt. During his first full-scale assault on it, a murderous struggle developed. Eyewitnesses said that cannonballs and shells fell like hail and the smoke was so thick that one could only rarely make out the enemy. Repulsed, the trench fell back while the first massive cavalry battle of the day engaged attention. Napoleon decided to commit his penultimate reserves and unleash Murat, but he too failed to make a breakthrough. It was not until early afternoon that Eugene's second onslaught at last made some ground when a cuirassier division finally broke into the rear of the redoubt. After a second great cavalry battle, the French held on to their gains. The whole of the original Russian line was taken, but Kutuzov simply retreated to the next ridge and formed up again. This was the moment when Napoleon could have won an outright victory by sending in the guard. But, despite many urgent entreaties from the marshals, he refused to do so. The usual explanation is his illness, but there was more to it than that. The emperor never liked to use the guard, whatever the circumstances, almost as though he were a Corsican peasant with one final secret hoard of gold that the tax collector knew nothing of. In this particular case, other considerations weighed. He felt that he was too far from his main base of operations to take any risks, which was partly why he had vetoed Davout's flanking movement, and, knowing well that even victory now would be no Austerlitz or Friedland, he hesitated to commit the flower of his army, reckoning that there must be at least one more battle to come. He may also have been appalled at the scale of slaughter he had already witnessed. Some authorities claim that Borodino was the worst single day's fighting in all history. The Grand Army alone fired G0000 artillery rounds and 2 million infantry cartridges. The Russians lost 44,000 dead and wounded and the French 35,000, though some military historians have claimed this is a conservative estimate, and the true total for the day's casualties is R0. It seems that initial estimates of death rolls in Russian warfare are always timid, so that the higher figure is 519 plausible. Even if we take the lowest possible figure, a modern observer has commented that this is the equivalent of a fully loaded Boeing 747 crashing with no survivors every 5 minutes for 8 hours. Whenever the emperor trained his field glasses on the Great Redoubt, he was cast down by what he saw. The Russians fought with such fanatical stubbornness that he remarked wearily to Berthier and Caulaincourt, "These Russians let themselves be killed as if they were not human beings at all but machines. They are not taken prisoner. This is not helping us. They are citadels which only cannonballs can demolish." During the night of the 7th of September, the Russians stole away from their second line of defense. No attempt was made to impede their departure, since the exhausted French army had been fought to a standstill. Kutuzov took the difficult but heroic decision to abandon Moscow, arguing that as long as the army continued in being, Russia could prevail, despite the loss of its great city. 7 days of unopposed marching brought the emperor within sight of the cupolas and onion domes of Moscow, which, despite its population of 250,000, retained its medieval look. But instead of the deputation of Muscovite nobles he had expected to wait on him, he found merely another ghost town. Only 25,000 people were left in the deserted and eerie city, and these, apart from foreigners and the sick and wounded, were the criminals that Kutuzov would not allow to join in the mass exodus. The day after Napoleon entered Moscow, a great fire engulfed the city and raged unchecked for 3 days. Properly speaking, several independent fires were started simultaneously by Russian arsonists under the orders of the governor of Moscow, Count Rostopchin, who had distributed explosive fuses to groups of saboteurs. When the French tried to extinguish the flames, they discovered that Rostopchin had removed all fire engines and destroyed all other firefighting equipment. Napoleon expressed disgust at this action by the Russians. Surely only barbarians would burn down their own cities. Could anyone imagine him ordering the gutting of Paris? But the rankers in the Grand Army took advantage of the 3-day confusion to loot and pillage with impunity, telling anyone who questioned their actions that they were salvaging goods from the inferno. It was R8 September before the emperor managed to stop the looting, restore discipline and put his commissariat on a proper basis. Taking up residence in the Kremlin, Napoleon remained blithely confident that he had only to sit it out and Alexander would come begging to make peace. While he waited for emissaries to arrive, the Russians played him at his own game and so regained the initiative. Kutuzov encouraged fraternization 520 between his Cossacks and the French cavalry, insinuating the idea that peace was just around the corner. Meanwhile, he steadily added to the 70,000 men he had been able to take away from Borodino. With local reinforcements and the arrival of 2 fresh armies, he amassed a fighting force CRS 0 strong. Napoleon's numbers had meanwhile shrunk to 95,000. Frustrated at the non-arrival of Russian emissaries, Napoleon urged Caulaincourt to undertake a mission to St. Petersburg. But the ambassador told his emperor that all such overtures made to the stubborn Alexander would be in vain. In fact, obduracy was not the only factor that limited the Tsar's freedom of action. He was under constraints, and if he had so much as bargained with the French, he would undoubtedly have been deposed or assassinated. Moreover, he saw well enough the difficulty the French were in and realized he held all the cards. In the end, Napoleon sent General Lauriston to treat with Kutuzov, initially to secure a laissez-passer for an embassy to St. Petersburg. Kutuzov refused to allow Lauriston to proceed but agreed to take Bonaparte's letter, proposing a compromise peace to the Tsar. He did so, but Alexander did not even deign to read it. In the Kremlin, Napoleon was deluged with bad news. Communications with Smolensk were becoming increasingly difficult, as the Spanish nightmare repeated itself, and semi-autonomous groups of peasant guerrillas sprang into existence. Soon their leaders' names became as well known as those of the bandidos in Spain: Davidov, Figner, Chetverakov. These men pioneered the atrocities that would make the R2 campaign in Russia one of the most ghastly in all history. Davidov's method was to greet the French with exaggerated courtesy, offer them food and drink, then slit their throats when they were drunk or asleep. The bodies would then be burned in pigsties or deep in the forests, for French retaliation was swift if ever they discovered newly turned graves near a village. Since so many patrols and supply convoys were cut off or ambushed by Russian partisans, Napoleon was forced to issue orders that no force less than R2 strong should ever leave Smolensk. The emperor knew from his Spanish experience that nothing demoralized his men more than a war where to be taken prisoner meant a far worse fate than a swift death in battle. He therefore tried to secure a guarantee from Kutuzov that atrocities would cease. Kutuzov sloughed off the responsibility and claimed that he could control only the troops in his army. When Napoleon sent a formal letter demanding that a code of behavior be imposed on the peasants, Kutuzov disingenuously replied as 521 follows: "It is difficult to control a people who for 300 years have never known war within their frontiers, who are ready to immolate themselves for their country, and who are not susceptible to the distinction between what is and what is not the usage of civilized warfare." Certainly a novel defense for war crimes, as it became increasingly obvious that both Kutuzov and the Tsar were stalling and all hopes of a negotiated peace were vain. Napoleon's mood became increasingly uncertain and febrile. Unable fully to comprehend Alexander's unreasonable stance, he clung to self-delusion and donned a mask of false optimism, in reality oscillating between inertia and anxiety. Louis-Philippe Ségur, whose diary is one of the most important sources for the campaign, wrote, "He prolonged his meals, which had hitherto been so simple and short. He seemed desirous of stifling thought by repletion. He would pass whole hours half reclined, as if torpid and awaiting, with a novel in his hand." Despite his previous scorn for novels, during the frustrating days in the Kremlin he would often take them up but found them impossible to read. He would stay on the same page for half an hour while his preoccupied mind drifted off elsewhere. Sometimes he would seek oblivion by playing vingt et un with Eugene de Beauharnais. More and more he seemed to be in a dream world. When told his troops needed winter clothing, he issued orders for their manufacture, but did not solve the question of who was to manufacture them and where in a deserted city. When informed that the artillery was short of horses, he at once authorized the purchase of Z0000 fresh mounts, though everyone knew there were no fresh horses to be had. Finally, at a war council on the 30th of September attended by Murat, Devout, Ney, Eugene and Berthier, he proposed marching on St. Petersburg. This chimerical idea was at once howled down by the marshals, and Napoleon may not have been wholly serious in suggesting it, but at least it held out the chance of activity rather than stagnation, which is what the emperor most wanted. Yet finally the nettle had to be grasped. Was the Grand Army to winter in Moscow, or was any other strategy feasible? Napoleon's increasingly neurotic state was a reflection of his dilemma. He knew that whatever course he opted for was fraught with risk and that he would never forgive himself if he chose wrongly. This is surely why he again delayed in a Russian city for no good reason, this time for a precious 35 days. It has been remarked wryly that it would have been better if the Great Fire of 17th of September had completely destroyed Moscow, as the emperor would then have been forced out. The options, repeatedly canvassed at war councils of the marshals, were essentially threefold: 522 remain in Moscow for 6 months, seek a second battle with Kutuzov and then continue south to the pleasanter weather and richer landscape of Kiev and the Ukraine, or retreat to Smolensk prior to an advance on St. Petersburg in the spring of 1813. The second option, seeking a second battle and marching to Kiev, appealed to Napoleon, who was reluctant to retreat without winning a decisive victory over Kutuzov. But the sheer volume of military, logistical and commissariat problems envisaged told against it in an army that could barely keep open its lines of communication with Smolensk. But Napoleon was unhappy about the prospect of a perilous so-day retreat to the Niemen. Contemplating his losses in the supposedly easy season of summer, how could he view the prospect of a winter trek with equanimity? As Caulaincourt pointed out, the Grand Army lacked everything necessary to combat the winter: sheepskins, stout fur-lined gloves, caps with ear flaps, warm boot socks, heavy boots to protect the feet against frostbite, frost nails for the horses' hooves. On the face of it, then, there seemed much to be said for the idea of remaining in Moscow, especially since there was enough food in the city to feed the army for 6 months. But Napoleon was still uneasy. It was true that his troops in Moscow had plenty of food, but if he tried to maintain the military status quo in Russia, his other far-flung units would starve. Kutuzov would grow in numbers, resources and confidence all winter. What if the Grand Army was beset by sickness so that its numbers dwindled even further? There was assuredly no hope of reinforcements from the west until next spring, and what would happen if Kutuzov launched another winter campaign, as the Russians had in 1806–07, the memory of the slaughter at Eylau, conflated with the recent bloodbath at Borodino, was enough to deter even the most reckless gambler. Yet possibly even more important than these weighty considerations was the old political imperative. Napoleon could not afford to be away from Paris so long. At last the emperor ended his vacillation and, on the 17th of October, ordered that the retreat to the Niemen should begin 2 days later. Then came news of a near disaster to Murat's advance guard at Vinkovo. After 3 weeks of shadowboxing with the Cossacks, and becoming used to the presence of Kutuzov's advance guard just an hour's march away, Murat grew careless. Kutuzov, meanwhile, under intense pressure to take action instead of, as he advised, waiting for General Winter to finish off the French, suddenly launched a surprise attack, inflicting Sioux casualties. The Russian offensive came close to annihilating Murat, who, however, managed to turn the tide at the 11th hour. Furious with Murat for 523 lowering his guard, Napoleon was none the less badly shaken, and there was an air of panic about the announcement that the departure would be brought forward by 24 hours. Ahead loomed 50 days that would confirm Bonaparte's greatness or destroy his power forever.